Are you ready to play chess like the Beast? I'm not referring to the Beast Jimmy Donaldson on YouTube, but rather I'm referring to Grandmaster from India Adiban, who has the nickname of the Beast, and in this game against Nuriz Delgado Ramirez from the FIDE World Cup Round 2, we will see why he has this moniker. And Adiban decided not to play his lifetime repertoire of b3. He said that ship has sailed, and he played the move d4 instead. And if you're looking for a very attacking, aggressive counter to the Nimzo Indian, which arises after e6, knight c3, and bishop b4, then this is the game for you. Adiban played the most ambitious move of pawn to f3, with the idea of supporting the e4 pawn break and taking the center with pawns, without allowing some knight takes e4 in reply. If you are enjoying this video, do make sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing if you are new to my channel. Let's continue with the game where Black played the move of d5. Actually, in his recent repertoire for the Nimzo Indian for Black, Ganguly, also an Indian Grandmaster and a long-time second of Vishy Anand when Anand was the World Chess Champion, he recommended the move c5 instead, which leads to a more Benoni type of structure after d5. That can be a good subject perhaps for a later video. If you want that, do let me know in the comments. I do read your comments and your requests, and I try to get back to as many of them as I can. Instead, the game went d5. And the idea of d5 is to put the pawn in the center and stop White taking the center himself with the move of e4. But now an extra merit to the move f3 becomes apparent after the move a3. Because now when Black plays bishop takes c3 and b takes c3, what we see here is that we basically have a same-ish variation. For those who don't know, the same-ish variation is the move a3 and this kind of position. But in these lines, it's not generally a great idea for Black to play the move d5 early. And the reason is that White will then take and undouble his pawns, so therefore he will keep his advantage of the bishop pair without the disadvantage of having a weak pawn on c4, which for example could be attacked after fixing it with c5. You could see moves like b6, and Black can play to eventually try and attack that pawn on c4 with his pieces, as Ganguly showed very well in his Nimzo Indian lifetime repertoire, which I did study quite recently. But instead, in this position that happens in the game, we see that d5 has already been played, so White will be able to trade off that pawn potentially. For example, if Black plays the move c5, which I think was a recommendation in an old lifetime Nimzo Indian repertoire by Daniel Barish and Christoph Silecki, who you might know as Chess Explained for you guys on YouTube. But that does still allow White to play c takes d5, and if knight takes d5, White has this very appealing move of d takes c5. It might not seem appealing at first because the pawns are doubled and Black can get his pawn back in some way, right? Well, it turns out that White is able to play moves like e4, kicking the knight, and also with an advantage of the bishop pair to work with. So, for example, a move like queen a5 actually is quite well went by the move e4. It turns out that whichever way that Black takes on c3, he kind of ends up in some danger after White just parries the check or parries the threat. And if Black does move the knight away with something like knight to f6, well then White can play a move like bishop to e3, just making sure that pawn is well defended, saying that if Black does take, yeah, he gets back the pawn, but White gains a lot of time attacking the queen, and it's still White will be better with the pair of bishops. Objectively, the position is equal. Black can play moves like castles, and meet moves like queen b3 with knight fd7, and just play to try and get back this pawn in some shape or form. Nonetheless, it's a position where with the bishop pair in the space, White also has his chances to fight for some practical advantage. So it's why the authors of past f3 works White have generally been quite happy to recommend these sorts of positions for White. If Black does play ed5, then White will go e3 and once again gets a very comfortable structure with the bishop pair, and a very flexible position where White can think about preparing the e4 break in the middle game after first completing his development and supporting it with his pieces. The game sort of moves c6 instead, which is a very reasonable shortcut and part of a deep strategic plan. The point is that now if White plays c takes d5, Black can take back with the c pawn, and he now has a backward c pawn on the half open file that he can pressure. Furthermore, black also has ideas such as being able to play b6. This is a system that I've played a fair bit with black myself in the past. And the idea is to go bishop a6 and simply trade off the white bishop pair, because trying to keep the bishop pair on the board and giving black this very strong bishop is not really in white's best interest. So usually the bishops get traded and black is going to be able to reroute his knight towards the c4 outpost. White does get his chance as well, but theoretically this is thought to be quite fine for black with this strategic plan we see here. The move that Ariban plays, by contrast, it is a pawn sack and it's also the most critical move. So hats off if you found the following continuation for white. The best move here is e4, which at first glance looks like a pawn sack, maybe in similar spirit to the black Mardima Gambit. But the idea is that after d takes e4 and f takes e4, that it's a little bit risky for black to take that pawn on e4. Because it turns out white can play the move queen to g4. Again, we see that the tactics are kind of working out for white, where black's not really in a position to take on c3, because then moves like queen takes g7, bishop h6 is creating all kinds of headaches against the black king in the center. But if you play knight f6 instead, well, white will take that pawn, rook g8 to attack the queen, queen h6. And I think that with white having the bishop pair in an open center, not to mention that the black king is still in the center himself, and even castling queenside still leaves black a bit weak on the light squares, or rather on the dark squares. This is the reason why I think white is a fair bit better in this kind of position. And so I think that the move that Delgado played with e5 is the better move. And it's also a good example of how to try to use your lead in development, because you're trying to open up the center. You also have moves like knight to e4 or queen a5 to pressure. And after knight f3, actually, black did play the move of queen to a5. Obviously, this is a very sharp position, and admittedly, this is not the purpose of the video to go through every single theoretical detail. But I do want to point out that knight takes c4, even though it's a pawn grab, the move queen c2 does allow white to keep fighting for the initiative. If black plays f5, we can play bishop d3, and kind of make the argument that with moves like bishop takes e4, that we're going to probably get our pawn back anyway. And also, black's king is still in the center, so there's a lot more going on in this position, but I think that white does have very good play after either castle short, playing it more like a gambit, or grabbing the pawn with knight e5, but allowing some queen h4 that admittedly is a little bit dicey. Something like queen h4, g3. Basically, this line, it looks very bad for white at first, and actually it would be with the pin against the pawn to the rook, except white has this move queen f2, a really beautiful move to pin the knight. And in this line with f4 and rook g1, it ends up being a little bit better for white, but still quite complex. But somehow white's lead development and bishops seem to be more important than the fact that black has an extra pawn, even if the queens were to come off. So an instructive variation. And I guess one thing that shows how deep the preparation of a player can go, where they prepare these engine-like lines that if you were playing in a practical game, you'd think there's no way you can get away with this, but the engine shows that it just works. And that's the way modern chess is, that if it works, it doesn't matter how ugly it is, you can still play it. It's kind of the modern engine philosophy when it comes to opening preparation. So very pragmatic in that sense. I think the safest move for black would probably be to play bishop to g4. And the idea is to pin the knight. One thing I didn't explain before, but because I think it's pretty straightforward, but white's never really going to play a move like d takes e5 in principle, because, well, black will simply get the pawn back, and white's pawn structure is a complete mess, and white completely loses the initiative. So you don't really want to release the tension unless it's with knight takes c5, but bishop g4 has just stopped that idea. White can definitely play moves like queen d3, and definitely it's still a very tense position where black has a few different plans. He can play a move like knight d7, which does allow white to play d takes e5 in a better version, but it's not the end of the world for black either. And there are more dynamic approaches where you can take and play the move c5 and basically make white's center perhaps look a lot stronger, but with the idea that by provoking d5 in order to keep the nice pawn chain, well, black can then go for ideas like taking on f3, pressuring this center, trying to block with an eye on e5. Of course, white has his ideas as well, but at a very high depth, we can probably conclude that the engine's assessment of equality is probably a fair one. Practically, I feel like it's probably easier to play white because the space and the bishop should count for something on a practical level. But yeah, if black is prepared deeper with the engine, it generally comes to equality. This is not a big secret. But maybe Delgado is a little surprised by this continuation, and he played a move Queen A5, which I think, while it's a very ambitious move to attack this pawn and keep your powder dry with knight e4, keeping that idea in reserve, I think it just doesn't work as well as black had hoped. It turns out the move bishop d2 is a really good defense here. The point is that queen c2 is not really quite as effective here, because now black can play e d4, showing why it's useful to pin that pawn, because white doesn't have c takes d4, because then it's a check. But if you play knight d4, your structure is just an absolute mess. You've got the double pawns, and the e pawn is weak, and black just has a beautiful outpost for knight on e5. So this is exactly what you want to avoid when you have the bishop pair, to be stuck with these weak pawns in a very fixed structure, where their knights have very stable outposts. So to avoid that, white is very happy to sacrifice a pawn with bishop d2, knight takes e4, and now a nice move with bishop to d3, giving up the pawn, but getting a nice lead in development with a fast castling kingside. A move like knight takes e5 might seem more natural, realizing that knight takes c3 would kind of be suicidal, putting the knight into a self-pin. But black can play moves like castles, and it turns out with moves like knight d7 that black will be able to use that open file against the king. And something like bishop d3, well, black can play even a move like knight to d7 actually. It turns out he doesn't even have to play knight takes d2 first, because after knight takes, if white does play bishop e4, then black's going to have rook e8 and he's going to get the piece back because of that pin on the e file. So white would probably castle, and black can even play rook e8 and just wait for a move before taking the bishop. And then in that arising structure, let's just say, for argument's sake, white does some move like c5. A position like this, I think, is already a tad more pleasant for black, because white's majority is a little less flexible than black's. The lack of an f-pawn does mean that long term, the white king is a little bit more exposed. So I think that after something like b6 and just leaving white with one more pawn island than black has in this position, white having 3 pawn islands to black's 2, I do think that this position is a little bit better for black, or at least on a practical level. So the move bishop d3 is definitely a better continuation. Black played the move knight takes d2, queen takes d2, and now I think that if black had a bit of a sense of danger, he might have considered cutting his losses at this point. Obviously, black just thought he could take lots of pawns and that there wouldn't be any kind of danger, which against a very strong attacking player like Adiban, who has a nickname also of being the Indian Mikhail Tal, well, that's definitely asking for trouble. The solid approach when you take a pawn is to find a way to give that pawn back to catch up in development and deal with the opponent's initiative. A way in which black could have done that is to move bishop to e6, with the idea that white's probably going to take the pawn because why not? And then after knight d7, black at least is able to trade off the knight to start to get a little bit of that initiative back with this counter threat. And if knight takes d7, black will just take back with the bishop, and then both sides will castle their kings. And okay, this position's a bit of a better version than the one we saw before, because black has played knight d2 a bit earlier, and white can try to bring the rooks over to create some attacking chance against the king. But objectively, black can bring his pieces to defense. He'll get counterplay down the e-file with the rooks, and that will allow him, objectively speaking, to maintain the balance. Although I would give white a very slight practical preference just because of the more active piece and a bit more space, but objectively it doesn't come to anything too special. Instead, black played e takes d4, and actually this move, believe it or not, is probably a decisive mistake. Of course, when you're playing a game, you don't know that it's a decisive mistake unless you prepared it all beforehand with the computer, but you can sort of feel that after the move of castles, which is definitely much more in the spirit of the position than taking here, that white is one move from completing his development. A check along the e-file would be extremely unpleasant for black. To give you an example, a move like queen c3, even if you don't see an immediate refutation, sure, you feel that with just one queen against a whole army that this is not going to be palatable for black. And indeed, after the move queen to e2, this is an incredibly unpleasant check, because if you try to move the king, just knight g5, and we see that white is simply crashing through on the 7th rank, and black is in no position to deal with that. And if you try to block with a move like bishop e6, trying to develop more pieces, again, knight g5 is just too strong. White's crashing through with knight takes e6, and then the queen and the rook are flooding into the attack. But if you castle, you run into bishop h7 and black loses in an even more brutal way than what we see in the game. King h8 and everything wins, but the easiest is probably just knight takes e6 and, well, they can't take back because of rook takes f8, but otherwise black is basically down a piece for nothing. So that's why black played the move castles instead. And now knight g5, just a very natural move. I realize I skipped ahead a little bit, but I think you guys probably saw it coming because we already saw the idea after queen c3, and it turned out to be no less effective, in fact, with the king castled. Black now played the move of f5, which at first glance seems like a very weakening move, but it does force white to play very precisely on this turn in order to show a winning advantage. As for the alternatives, black could play a move like g6 instead, but then the black king is very exposed, and there's actually a few good continuations from here for white. The one I think that's the most effective is just to keep developing with rook a1, and with the idea of rook a1 we just make sure that every single piece is involved in the attack, and only then do we make our decisive blow. So for example, d takes c6, d takes c3, we play queen to f4, we're threatening to crash through on h7 for example, on f7 I should say, and if black plays a move like f6, I'll point out by the way that queen c5, king h1 that throwing these moves would not really do anything beneficial for black, but now white has a very nice combination to win the game. Actually, this is a good moment to pause the video to see if you can indeed play like the beast. Okay, he didn't get this position in the game, but I'm 100% sure he would have found this move had we got to this point. So let's see if you're up to the task and you can unleash your inner beast. Okay, so you've had a chance to write in the comments below what your move would be here. Well done if you realise that knight takes h7 is a decisive blow. At the moment, the pawns are the only thing standing between white's attacking forces and the king. And, well, in this case, queen c5 is probably the best defense. At least making sure that after king h7, you're not running into some rook e7 check because the queen is covering it. But we have another way to get in. We can play the move of queen to g3. Technically, queen to e4 is also winning, but I like queen g3 because it reduces black's options a little bit more, I think. There's no bishop f5, for example, because you can simply chop it off. Instead, if black plays a move like f5, well, white can just play... Actually, he has a couple of winning moves here, as it turns out. But I think that the simplest one is just to play queen to h4, just bringing the piece into the attack with tempo. After something like king g7. King g8 will come to the same thing for what it's worth. Rook to e7. Rook f7 is the only real defense. But then rook to e8. And white is just getting in with the pieces. It's kind of like an AlphaZero type of game almost. In the sense that white is just playing using his lead development and saying that black's queenside pieces just won't get the time to get into the game and to come to the defense of the black king. Since the move queen h8 mate is a big threat, the move rook f8 is a logical defense. But after the move rook e1, just preparing the move rook e7 to bring the final piece into the attack, there's no good defense for black here. Rook e7 is basically going to win at least the queen, because if you don't have queen e7, you basically get mated. For example, knight d7, rook e7, and either black gives up the queen, or he plays rook f7 and allows checkmate with queen to h8 as such. And if you play a move like rook takes c8, it's the same kind of problem, where the threat is just to play queen to h8 and to effectively checkmate with these pieces. Not to mention that a move like king f7, well, you can still take that bishop and even get back some material while keeping a big attack. And if they play some move like knight a6 or knight d7 trying to save the bishop, well, in that case, the easiest is probably rook to e7, where either black gives up the queen and white has a decisive material advantage, not to mention that the black bishop and rook are still completely out of play. Honestly, we could add the knight to that as well. Or you move the king and you get mated with king f8, queen f6 and mate on the next move. Or the other way is king to g8, queen h7 to make sure that all of us are on the same page. This will be mate as well. So there you have it. We see that g6 is not really saving the game either. And a move like knight d7 just allows white to take h7 and open up the black king. So the move f5 at least has the advantage that if white doesn't find exactly the right move here, then it turns out black will be able to survive. So again, let's see if you can play like the beast. And the beast did find the right move for white here. So what was Adiban's choice in this position with white to play? Okay, you had a chance to pause. Well done if you found the following move for white. It turns out that the disadvantage of f5 is that you are making this diagonal very, very weak. And it might seem at the moment that there's no real way to exploit that, but actually there is. The move c5 is a very fantastic move, and it's one of the moves that really make this game an absolute brilliancy to behold. Because if black takes that pawn, or if he takes any of the pawns basically, the refutation is the same. Queen to a2, king to h8, knight to f7 check. And okay, you guys know the beautiful queen sack smothered mate, right? If you don't, well, it comes up after king g8, knight to h6 check, king to h8, and now we have a beautiful checkmate in 2. If you don't see it, this is your chance to pause, but I think you guys probably see it quite fast. So queen g8, and we make sure that the rook is blocking the king's escape, so that knight f7 is smothered mate. Because of this little combination, it more or less forces black to play rook takes f7 here to avoid mate. But even though black is taking a million pawns and putting them all in the bank, unfortunately having all this money in the bank doesn't really do you that much good if you can't actually withdraw it and make use of it with some investment or some very important purchase. And that's what we see happening for black here. That white is threatening a back rank mate. The move queen d5 tries to stop it. But if white just plays queen e7, you're not even threatening to take the bishop because there's a queen to f8 mate. Meanwhile, white just ready to bring more of the pieces into the attack, and once more we see that black's lack of development is what seals his fate at this point. So, given that queen takes c5 doesn't really work, black played king h8, which at least anticipates queen to a2. It gives black time to bring the queen back and to defend his f7 point at least, for example. But it turns out that while queen a2 is still not a bad move, that Ardiban's move of queen e2 is actually a lot more effective here. And white's idea is simply to go after this h7 point. For example, if black were to play a move such as, let's say he plays queen takes c5 and just tries to grab lots of pawns. It turns out that queen to h5 is simply winning here. White is clearly threatening queen h7 checkmate. The way to deal with that is to move pawn to h6. Let's say we throw in d takes c3 just because it's with a check. But king h1 puts the king to safety. And after h6, well, white has a few winning moves, in fact. If you want to bring all the pieces into the attack, and it's a very good attacking principle to follow, you could start with the move rook ae1 if you wanted to, with ideas of bring the rook in to just dominate on the back rank. Of course, this is bearing in mind that black is not threatening to take the knight on g5 because our queen is pinging their h-pawn to the king. But the move knight to f7 I think is the simplest here, because black more or less has to take that knight. And in that case, white, even though black is up material with a knight and 4 pawns for the exchange, what's more important is that black has no queenside development. White is threatening just to take that bishop or even to bring the rook in the attack. And with all these pieces in the attack against a lone king, black is in no position to survive. As long as white keeps the queens on the board for his initiative, there's really nothing black can do to save himself here. And if black does move the king, well, a move like king g8 just runs into something like knight takes h6. It's the only clearly winning move, but it's easily good enough. After knight, they take the knight, we go queen g6, making sure that we can take that pawn with a tempo, king h8, queen h6, king g8, and this is all just very lawnmower style, for those of you who remember your beginner school classes, with the lawnmower bringing the queen and the rook over to checkmate the king. And so we do this with rook f3, and there's simply no good defense to rook h3 checkmate, because if you try to play f4 and cover it with the bishop, then you allow queen to h7 checkmate, like so. That's the reason why black played a move knight d7, and that takes the sting out of queen h5 at least, because now knight f6 would defend the h7 point and also attack the queen on h5. It turns out, however, that the blow comes from a different angle. Again, if you don't find exactly the right move here as white, then black will manage to survive. So again, can you play like the beast? It's white to play. Well done if you realize that the winning move is the move knight takes h7. Okay, a move like c takes d4 still keeps an advantage, but it would not really strike while the iron is hot. And it turns out that black is not able to take that knight, because after king takes h7, we have the move queen to h5, king g8 is the only legal move. And now bishop c4 check. We see just how useful that c5 move proved to be for setting up the attack on the king, as black's only legal move is rook to f7, and then we checkmate with takes, king moves, and queen h5 checkmate from here. So in the game, black played the move d takes c3, which is already a desperation measure, saying I can't deal with the threats to my king, so I'll just go down taking more material, like the bandits trying to take the gold from El Dorado. Well, white played the move queen to h5, which is setting up knight to f6 checkmate. We had queen takes c5, king in the corner, and since knight f6 is a big checkmate threat, black moved the king out of the way, and white simply crashed through with bishop takes f5, opening the f file, also threatening a bishop to e6 check. We see Ariban doing a great job of bringing all the pieces into the attack, and also playing with tempo, making sure that with this flow of threats that black does not get the time to bring his other piece into the game and thus to use his material advantage. Black played the move queen to d5 as an attempt to cover this e6 square, but then knight to g5, threatening a mate on h7 with the queen. Black tried to cover that with the move knight f6. If you play a move like rook takes f5, well, white will play queen to h7 anyway, and after king f8, rook takes f5, we simply win the queen with z fork. Black played the move knight f6, and this is where it's up to you to see if you can find the crowning move. This position is the reason why I'm showing you this game. Shout out to my subscriber, Jean-Yves Agar, for saying, Max, you've got to cover this game. It is absolutely brilliant because of the epic, well, I nearly gave away the answer, but because of the epic move that was played here. So can you find it? As always, you can pause the video if you need more time to think about it. For those who just want to see the answer, here you go. White won with the move queen to h7, which is actually the only winning move in this position. It's worth pointing out that, okay, you can move the bishop back and forth, and okay, it also ends up being technically winning, but you sort of have to find that queen sack idea to really, to find a win for sure. Actually, to be fair, maybe that's not 100% true. In this position, I think you can technically play to move bishop to e4, and you can take their queen on the next turn, because if they play knight takes, you are going to have rook takes f8 and queen g8, and now knight f7 is checkmate. So I stand corrected. There's actually two ways to win in this position, but the one that actually forces mate in reality is the move queen to h7, an absolutely magnificent queen sacrifice to which Delgado Ramirez resigned, because after the move queen h7, well, black has to take, there's no other legal move. Bishop takes h7, and let's play the moves together. King h8, rook f8, queen to g8, and now rook takes g8 checkmate. This game qualifies not only as a brilliancy, but also as a miniature, because the game was only 22 moves long. I show it with my hands, but I don't have enough fingers for showing the moves. Anyway, I think you'll agree that this was an absolutely beautiful game, and it's games like this that make Ariban definitely one of the more exciting grandmasters to follow and watch, especially if you have a very dynamic attacking style, and you like openings such as very aggressive 1e4 and d4 openings. If you like things like the King's Indian and other aggressive systems, then Ariban is a good expert to follow for these kind of lines. With that being said, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up. Obviously, you've been enjoying it if you've watched this so great work. And also consider subscribing if you are new to the channel. I'll allow you to enjoy more of my chess video content and to improve your chess with a grandmaster while enjoying your chess even more along the way. With that being said, that's all I have for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Get out of here.